This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. Steve here, and I am joined by author and attorney Dave Gerrard, also known as Dov Preminger. Is there one you prefer with? Do you want to go with Dave?
I go by Dov Preminger. Yeah, that's my actual name. And then Dave Gerrard was the pen name under which I wrote The Law of the Sea.
Why did you go with the pen name? That was kind of something that crossed my mind.
So, yeah, I get asked that a lot. The reason was when I first published the book, I didn't know how it would be received, and in case it was a total flop, I wanted some kind of cover out there between me and the internet so that anybody Googling my name wouldn't just come up with, this novel if it was really bad. So the pen name was kind of a bit of a cover for me just in case.
So we're going to get back to that. I have a question about that because that's a pretty interesting part of the whole story. But so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? And then I think that'll lead into the really interesting aspects of your book, which is Law of the Sea.
Yeah. So, I'm an attorney. That's my work for the past 10 years or so. I was born in Israel. My parents are from Chile and Zimbabwe. I grew up in Los Angeles. I went to law school rather late. I'd always kind of written for fun here and there. I've been a journalist for a minute, written short fiction. And I practiced law for about 10 years, which is very writing and reading intensive. And, I wrote The Law of the Sea actually during the pandemic. So that was a pretty difficult time for me. I just moved to Austin in Texas, and about 6 months after I moved here, the city shut down, the country shut down, and I didn't really know anybody here at the time, so I didn't have much to do, and it was going to be this pretty rough period for me, so I just kind of said, well, I'm going to write a book, which is something that I guess you could say it was on my bucket list. It's something that I thought about doing for a long time, but I never had the time to do it, and the pandemic, honestly, is what gave me the time and the drive to do it.
Now, so The Law of the Sea, you could call it a courtroom thriller, but it's also a history novel. Can you maybe give us a short synopsis of the book so that we have something to grab onto, and then we'll get into some of the really interesting aspects of the book?
Yeah. So, the synopsis, The Law of the Sea, is about a young lawyer set in Houston, Texas, who gets this new client, Ashley Markham. She comes into him at a pro bono clinic. And she says that her brother's passed away under mysterious circumstances, right? And she kind of comes in and gives him these gold coins, these ancient gold coins that come out of nowhere. And no one knows what happened to them, where the coins are from, all of this. And so this launches off this kind of legal saga where Jack and Ashley have to go up against these big corporations and their lawyers and try to find out what happened to Ashley's brother and try to find out what these coins are and where they're from. And that kind of leads us into some law and history and shipwrecks and that sort of thing as they discover that's where the coins are from. That's the premise of the thing.
What I thought was really cool about the book is that it was really hard to put it into one genre. It was a drama, it was a courtroom thriller, and it was a history novel. It was almost, especially with the sea aspect of it, Moby Dick-esque, where you would have the plot in the fictional part, but then you'd go on some pretty long discussions on the legal aspects. What were some of the influences that on you for in creating this novel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably my three biggest influences, and I kept these three books on my table when I was writing this, were John Grisham's The Firm, right? And that's kind of a classic legal thriller that gave it that aspect. And then there was Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. And that's sort of where I got some of the historical angle from, right? He kind of traces a lot of history and real things into this story. And then finally, there was Michael Crichton. I think I probably had Prey. I've always been a fan of his stuff, and just kind of he writes these sort of techno thrillers, but they're very realistic. They'll have a lot of real detail. You learn a lot of real things, and then he applies it to this fictional story. And all of them are just very good, I think, thriller writers, and they just know how to keep turning the page. So I would say for this style of book, those guys were my influences.
Yeah, I definitely get the Michael Crichton vibe now that you say that the technicalities of it added to the thriller aspect was a very cool thing. And that's one of the main reasons that I wanted to get you on, is that the blend of those three things. So maybe we could start off on the history side of it. What was your influence to set the novel in this? It's set in the present, but it's drawing back to these shipwrecks. And I wonder, what was your inspiration for that? And what was maybe your research process? Because there's a lot, it's very dense on the technicalities of the history.
It is. And some people look at the cover and they think that it's this novel about ancient shipwrecks. They don't realize it's a modern legal thriller. So sometimes I think I should make the cover a bit more modern, but I like it. And then, so the idea came to me. I was actually scuba diving. I was at a scuba diving resort in Israel, and I picked up this magazine, scuba diver magazine, whatever, and it just said $500 million treasure found at the, by modern day treasure hunters. So I was like, what? Like, are you serious? And then I started reading about it, and it was an article about the Black Swan wreck that was found by Odyssey Marine, might have been 2007. It's one of the ones I mentioned briefly in the book. And you have some kind of case law quotations from it. And I was just fascinated that, in this day and age, you have people digging up buried treasure, basically worth $500 million, $1 billion. And I found this really fascinating. And that idea kept hold of me. This was like 15 years ago that I read this magazine. And I just was thinking about it. And eventually I thought this would be a really cool subject for a novel, because later on, as I became a lawyer, I remember I was reading kind of some of these court opinions about these treasure wreck and how they got found and how people were fighting over them. And you have all this legal and historical detail. And I just found it really fascinating. I thought it would be ripe for exploration with a novel. And I kind of came at it with this sort of legal angle. That's how it's approached. And then you kind of go back into all of this history. And, what really fascinated me is, I'm trying to think about how much I can talk and how much would cause spoilers. Do you have thoughts about that?
Maybe a little spoiler-ish, but I think that it's hard to spoil this whole novel because it really is. There's something coming up every chapter that builds and builds. So okay. I definitely, if people are out there, you're listening, definitely go and get the book.
So I will say, the particular, shipwreck, that's the subject of this, right? And you know what that is. It's this mystery that's never really been solved. I kind of looked at a number of these shipwrecks. I looked at a lot of history, and this one particular one struck me because it was one of the biggest ships that ever sank, and no one ever definitively found it a long time ago. And I thought, how is it possible that no one's found this? Why is there not more information about it? I mean, the best I could find was some bootleg random page that somebody put up on like Yahoo GeoCities many years ago. And I'm thinking, how is there not more out there? And I just kind of read everything I could and tried to piece together what I thought might have happened, including going back to some of the source material, like these, ancient kind of diaries or explorer collections of letters and things like that by people who were there at the time. And so it was this kind of mystery that sort of fascinated me and drove me to kind of write the novel and give my take on what happened. Because to me, it's a real mystery.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
So, these small ones get found all the time. Probably a lot of them have been found now, but as technology develops further, you have things like, sonar that can scan the deep ocean bed and So people are finding some ones that were harder to find earlier that might have sank very deep, right? And big ones happen now and then. You see something new every couple of years at least. And I talk about some of the really big ones in the book. You kind of get a background of some of the major ones, the smaller ones. And in terms of how all this happened, I mean, a lot of these were from the Spanish trade with the New World. Around maybe, I think it was the 1500s, super roughly. The Spanish had basically taken the New World, South America, and they were just taking gold bullion, from America and then shipping it back to Spain, making them the richest country in the world at the time in Europe and giving them enormous power. But about a third of these ships probably sank because the Atlantic Ocean crossing is really dangerous. And it was just a fact of life. So you have all this massive amount of gold and silver just going to the bottom of the ocean, but it didn't even matter because there was so much coming across that we're becoming rich. And so a lot of this is kind of leftovers of that trade, right? And this happened elsewhere in the world too. And especially, the Portuguese Empire had the other half of the world at that time. And so they were kind of sailing ships across Asia. And you had the same kind of situation, these massive ships. And this was just the risk of transporting them. And the ocean is just so big and so deep that when they sink, sometimes you just don't find them for a long time. So I don't know that I was really shocked by things, but there were some things that I felt were, a little bit unfair. Like when you had, for instance, this Odyssey Marine case where this company had spent a lot of time and a lot of money finding this shipwreck they codenamed Black Swan, which turned out to belong to the government of, it's been a minute, so I think the government of Spain, right? And, basically this company were the ones that found it, unearthed it, brought it to the surface and everything. But then Spain came in and said, no, that's mine. You can't get any of it. And I think it's absolutely fair to say, yes, it's Spain's treasure, right? And that should be theirs. But there's also kind of some sense of unfairness as they never would have found it if not for Odyssey, right? And for instance, I think that in the UK, they have some kind of laws about this where if a treasure hunter finds something, they're entitled to actually a portion of it. I forget what it is. It might be a third, something like that. But in other places like Spain, they're just not. And so it seems like they kind of just, got taken for a ride here. And the court kind of comes down on them pretty hard because saying they did some stuff that was a bit backhanded, right? So there's no blameless people here. It's all kind of gray. But it did strike me as a little bit unfair that they got nothing. And also you had this other case, an even bigger one, the San Juan, I think it was. And this was found off the coast of Colombia. And it seemed like this company that had found it had made a deal with the Colombian government where they were going to get a certain portion of it for recovering this. And it seemed like the Colombian government then just backed out of the deal, said, nope, too bad. What are you going to do about it? And so the interesting thing here legally is you're running up against sovereign countries here. And, there's not so much you can do when an entire country says, you're not getting any of this. That's my ship, piss off. And you see that some of these cases make their way to the U.S., right? And that's what I discuss a lot in the book. But ultimately, I think a lot of times the U.S. courts are going to say, it's not our jurisdiction. We can't really rule so much on sovereign property of another nation. And there's a lot of caveats to that. And I get into kind of sovereign immunity law and how all that works. And it provides kind of a framework for the novel. But some of it did seem a bit unfair to me when I was reading through it. But that doesn't surprise me anymore, having been a lawyer for a minute.
Well, then you get into those questions that you delved into of jurisdiction, where the ship was originally owned by the Spanish 500 odd years ago. It's found in Colombian waters. That was a colony of Spain, but now Colombia is a sovereign nation. And then they bring the case to the U.S. because it's a U.S.-based company. And that really gets very complicated.
Yeah, it does. And I try to make this legally as realistic as possible so that I like that kind of novel because I want the reader to have the sense of this is something that could actually happen. All of this is very real, and the more I can get into the actual legalities and kind of tell you how it's really going to play out, even to the point of citing actual court opinions and letting you know about real courts and things like that, the more real it feels. But yeah, it does get pretty complicated legally, and I try to bring in all those complexities in a dramatic, fun way And I also try to kind of educate the reader a little bit about how this works without making it too difficult to understand.
And I have to imagine that you have some, and maybe you saw this in your research, you have the practicality that these companies, it's not like they're freebooters that just stumble onto a wreck. They're hundreds of feet or even miles deep. So they need a lot of complicated equipment. So they have a big investment, but then they want to make hundreds of millions of dollars off of these things. But it's not like just finding oil or gold ore. These are extremely historically important artifacts, really, from the ship to the bullion that they find. What were some of the things that you maybe saw or researched, or even what you were thinking about with the complexities that these are historically incredibly important artifacts?
I tried to kind of present all the different sides of this, right? And there is that side of it too, that, these ships that sank are, they belong to these countries, right? And they have maybe the bones of Spanish sailors down there, and they might have some artifacts that the country would want, right? The history of it. But then they're also filled with money, this fungible bullion, silver, gold, stuff like that. And that's kind of part of how the legalities play out here, right? A court will look to, okay, to what extent is this really sovereign property? Or to what extent is this just money being carried across the sea? And so, you kind of play that out a little bit. And then you also have this other really interesting issue, which didn't come up so much in the court cases, but, this treasure, that, for example, that Spain might have had or that Colombia might have had with some of these ships, well, that was taken from the New World, right? That was taken from South America. And so then you have these interventions by some of these South American nations saying, hey, that's not Spain's gold. That's not Spain's property. That's our property. And that was appropriated hundreds of years ago. And so you have kind of even more complex questions about it then. Like, okay, well, maybe it's not the treasure hunters. Maybe it's Spain's, but maybe it's not actually Spain's. Maybe it belongs to, Colombia or something like that.
One thing that, I guess coming into it as not a lawyer, we really think about it that if something is a question in the U.S., you go to the court, and it might be a state court or a federal court or eventually the Supreme Court. What is the situation of the court when there's something like this, where there's so many companies involved in sovereign nations all over the world? How does that get settled out?
So that's that's where it gets really complex, right? And these kind of cases turn on legal doctrines like sovereign immunity. The U.S. courts, basically, the default position they want to take is they can't really rule with respect to sovereign nations, other countries, right? U.S. courts have jurisdiction in the U.S., but they can't go and order, say, China to do something. And then it gets a little bit hairy when you have questions about U.S. companies doing certain things and they're opposing sovereign nations. And a lot of times what the U.S. courts will say, we don't have jurisdiction. Sorry, we just can't do anything about it, which I think is probably the right approach. And then what ends up happening is you just have kind of the realities of geopolitics here, right? Like, okay, like where is the ship? If it's a couple miles off the coast of Colombia, realistically, what are you going to do about it? I mean, what are you going to go against, like the Colombian Navy and go and try to take the ship? No. Is the U.S. going to back you up in that? No. So ultimately, with these shipwrecks sort of transcend the jurisdiction of any kind of courts to some extent. And it ends up just being almost a case of geopolitics, or, who is right there? Like, in whose backyard is this, and how can they get it, and how can you stop them? So, although it's presented here as a legal question, a lot of these cases are legally brought in U.S. courts. In the end, a lot of times what they'll say is, sorry, we can't help you here. Like, this is just outside of our jurisdiction.
Does that generally, with this sort of thing then, does that just stop the exploration of the ship? Or do the companies just go ahead and take the stuff, for the lack of a better word, from the ships? Has there been any sort of Any sort of examples of that where maybe the ships were just raided, essentially?
I'm sure that happens because, you have to think that if you're like a person or a company and you're out there looking for buried treasure, so to speak, and you find out that every time you report it, the country comes in and claims it, maybe you're not going to say anything the next time. And so obviously it's unreported and we don't know, but certainly given the climate of how this stuff works, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of shipwrecks get found and then people take the stuff and don't ever say anything. Because almost why would they, right? And there are probably wrecks of a certain size where that's not really feasible anymore, right? I mean, you in the Black Swan case that I referenced in the book, you had this company take about 17 tons of silver and fly it to a private warehouse in Gibraltar, right? Which is going to raise some eyebrows. Somebody's going to notice that. Or suddenly you're unloading, tons and tons of silver bullion that has engravings from a certain century. Well, someone's going to wake up and say, hey, where did you get that? But I wouldn't be surprised if, just given how the legalities have played out, people don't report some of these finds. So, I think it could be good if some kind of law was adopted, whereby people would get some kind of fixed fee. It could be 20%, could be a third, something like that, for finding these, which would incentivize people to find them, bring them up, report them, and sort of split them with the countries. But unfortunately, you don't really have a legal framework that can encompass the whole world like that.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. Yeah, I think that's what's really challenging about it is you have something that is so financially, in modern day sense, valuable. And then the history, like I think of Israel that has the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and they're just dealing with the little potsherd that people find or a little statue. And then people can sell those for massive amounts of money in the private market. And then, it basically destroys the provenance of this. Like you said, if somebody pulls up, a ton, literally a ton of gold, they can just melt that down. Then we've lost the total historical value of that ship. There's a lot of financial interest and incentive to just destroy these things, the historical value of it, in order to make a very large monetary profit. Now, moving on to the legal aspect of it, was this something that in your law work you had done anything similar to this? Was there anything like that, or was maybe the base of it somewhat in some way tied to your legal experience?
Yeah, so that's right. I haven't done really any maritime cases or anything like that as a lawyer, but the whole legal process that you see throughout the book is basically how the legal process plays out in my cases, right? In a different scale, in a different context. But, it's really not about that much about maritime law. It's really giving you kind of a general grounding in how civil litigation works. And so a lot of these were kind of inspired by sort of real cases or real things that I've done, or, just kind of experiences that I've had. And that definitely informed a lot of these scenes and a lot of these dramas. And so that's all stuff that, that a corporate litigator will deal with. Things like depositions and how that works and how you strategize and these hearings and what court you want to file in and how the judge is going to look at this. That's all stuff that I've dealt with in my life.
One thing that I found, really the basis of the book, and I don't think we're getting, just giving people a little taste, is that the lawyer in this, he finds this case by doing some pro bono work at a legal aid clinic. And maybe you could explain a little bit about that legal aid, why lawyers do basically free legal work. And obviously the case grows out of this. Has there been any big examples of that where a lawyer finds a case just in legal aid and then it explodes into something huge?
I haven't seen that. I'm sure it's happened. I haven't seen it, but I will say that the intro scene in that pro bono clinic was inspired by, me going to these pro bono clinics in my practice. And, I will I try to do it maybe once a month or every couple months, probably more realistically. I go to these pro bono clinics, and you just sit there and people come in and you try to give them some basic legal advice for free to help them out. And so I did these in Houston too. And that's kind of, and that experience kind of sparked the first chapter and how I saw this story kind of coming to fruition and starting out. So I can't say that I ever had a client come in with all that kind of stuff and treasure and everything, but the pro bono scenes were definitely inspired by real things, and I just imagined that something might come in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of is a metaphor that the main character of the book finds this gold, essentially. I mean, it's literal gold, but it's also metaphorical, that hours upon hours of just helping somebody with a little matter with the will or a parking ticket. And then you have this huge tsunami of a case come into your lap. I thought that was a really cool theme that kind of carried throughout the entire novel.
That's interesting. And I hadn't really thought about that, actually. So it's interesting you point that out.
Now you get into, I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book is that you didn't necessarily sugarcoat the legal aspects. And in a lot of ways, you show the more boring side of the legal profession, but you explain it in an interesting way that keeps the plot moving forward. What were some of the things that, like writing briefs and that sort of thing, what were maybe some of the aspects of the legal part that you find particularly interesting and that you wanted to show a broader audience?
So I guess one reason was so that I could have the story told realistically. You know, it almost gave a backbone to the story and a skeleton and a framework for me to proceed on, because I know how a case goes. It goes from, demand letters to filing to discovery to documents to hearings to trial. And it kind of actually helped me outline how the novel would go and gave me a framework to stick to. And I wanted to just kind of be really real with the reader and let you know that this is real. This is how it goes. This is how it works. But certainly, like you said, I don't sugarcoat, the legal system. There's a lot of things that are exciting and dramatic, but there's a lot of things that are boring and sometimes seem a bit unjust or, pointless. And, I did think about that a minute because, I'm a lawyer, and at the time I was working for a bigger law firm, and I wondered, okay, well, how much should I say about this stuff, right? Should I kind of maybe go easy on it? But I felt that I had a responsibility to just say everything about my experience and just kind of give it to everybody straight. And there's also kind of a history of I think, poking fun at some of the law or some of the big law stuff that, goes back to John Grisham and some of the stuff that I read from him. And so I kind of felt okay poking a little bit of fun at it, or kind of showing you maybe the darker side or the less good side of it, because there's certainly good things about it too, and that appears in the book as well.
When somebody gets a case like this, you get into it a bit in the book, but generally, I think people often expect, well, if I sue somebody, I'm going to, and there's $1 million at play, I get $1 million as the winner. But is that how it works in the legal system?
Not necessarily. I mean, so personal injury cases can be straightforward that way, right? You get injured, you could sue, and they're going to pay. But stuff like business litigation, which is stuff that I do, and it's kind of what's featured in the book, in the fight about all this stuff, is a lot less simple. And usually, a lot of times, it can end up costing, even more than you can make sometimes. And so this is something that goes really toward my own legal practice more than fiction. But I always tell people, they have an expectation sometimes. I've been wronged. I should get all my money for it. But it's not really the way it works a lot of times. Sometimes you just have to spend a lot of money and you don't get everything that you want. Litigation can be a little bit more like warfare in that way, where you don't necessarily have any winners. A lot of times everybody just loses a little bit.
Yeah, I thought I was thinking of that, of warfare. It really does strike as warfare. And one of the antagonists was very bloodthirsty and cutthroat. Is that generally how it goes in litigation like that, where it's everybody is just at each other's throats the entire time? Or is there a collegial nature to it?
It's a bit of both. You definitely have all of those aspects and all of those characters, right? Like the antagonists and sort of the main, the bad guys, so to speak, although I wouldn't necessarily call them all bad, but there are absolutely a lot of lawyers in real life just like that or worse, right? And I've come across them before and I've worked with them before. And but then you have other lawyers that are a little bit more collegial. I think that, it kind of depends on where you are. Sometimes in smaller places, in Texas, Austin, Texas in particular, it could be a little more collegial. Every town has its own vibe. And, in particular, the antagonists here come from this big New York law firm. And the New York law firms are kind of notorious for being very cutthroat and very aggressive and adversarial. So a lot of times they'll kind of come in and just play that way, play really rough. And it can be pretty unpleasant, right? And then sometimes it works and you can scare people and you can just make them give up. And then sometimes it backfires and it doesn't work out for you. But unfortunately, sometimes it does.
You mentioned earlier how you were worried about how it was perceived, how it would be perceived. How was the novel perceived, if you don't mind me asking, within the legal community or amongst your colleagues?
So everyone's pretty much loved it, including the lawyers, including the paralegals, the secretaries. Like so many of my friends and colleagues have read it, and everyone's really liked it. So, or maybe they just haven't told me if they didn't. So, but I think it's generally been acknowledged to be pretty true and pretty accurate in characterizing how the legal world works. I will say that. You can kind of get a good primer about how all this works by reading the book. And yeah, I try to be, I once read this book by Stephen King called On Writing, where he talks just a little bit about his writing process. And the one thing that stuck with me is he says that writers have an obligation to tell the truth. You need to go and sit down before a blank page and tell the truth, right? And there's different truths, obviously, but I kind of kept that with me. And, nothing in this book I think is actually particularly controversial, right, as it turned out, But there were times when I thought about maybe just kind of going easy on something or censoring a little bit of this. And I didn't, because I thought, well, I've got an obligation here to just tell the truth. Tell my experience, tell how I would actually do this without shading it at all. So I pretty much didn't.
And having written this book, obviously writing a novel, especially one that's so research dense, is not an easy and it takes a great deal of time. Have you thought of writing another novel?
Oh, I already have. I just published about 2 months ago.
Oh, that's maybe give us a little hint about that novel, because I did not see that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because this one is under my real name, Dov Preminger, instead of Dave Gerrard. I went with now that I'm a little more comfortable that my work was being received well, I decided to put my real name out there. So this one is called Glyph. It's under my name, Dov Preminger. And this is really interesting. It's similar in some ways, but also totally different. This is kind of a techno thriller. And it's about cryptocurrency and hacking and government surveillance and cyber warfare. And so it kind of takes, whereas The Law of the Sea was a legal thriller and it kind of looked at everything through this legal lens and you learned all about the legal system. This one is a really modern techno thriller. And it teaches you about things like the hacking and cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and Satoshi Nakamoto. And it kind of tells this really wild story. I think it's even wilder than The Law of the Sea in a lot of ways. Kind of through the lens of technology, but with kind of the same page-turning style.
Well, you got me sold on that one. I wish I had heard about that one, too. I'm going to go get that one right now. That sounds a type of book I would love. Is that so? Do you think, I guess as a follow-up to that, do you see yourself writing more thrillers then? Do you have ideas for your third?
I do have ideas, but I need a break from all the writing right now. It's a huge endeavor to do something like this, right? And it's The Law of the Sea took me probably a year and a half, which was extremely fast, I think, to write about a 500-page novel when I'd never written a novel before. But I basically just, I was locked down anyway. I said, okay, anytime I have a free time, I'm just going to be writing this novel. So basically, anytime I wasn't working, I was just, sitting down there writing nights, weekends, pretty much every free minute is what I was doing.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on. If people want to find your work, where's the best way to find your novels?
You can just get them on Amazon, and they're in paperbook, ebook, and The Law of the Sea is also in audiobook form narrated by me. So if you could stand my voice for about 13 hours, then you can get that version as well. And then you could check out Glyph as well under Dov Preminger. And that's you can find that on Amazon as well.